Talk on infrastructure for the transition to net zero. I'm going to talk a little bit about what net zero means and how I think the infrastructure in the UK and other countries, but mainly focusing on the UK, how infrastructure will have to change and what that in itself means for us. So firstly, net zero. It's very simply the point at which the amount of greenhouse gas emitted into the atmosphere by human activity in the UK, because we're talking about this country, equals the amount of greenhouse gas that is being taken out of the atmosphere. And as some of us know, greenhouse gases can be taken out by the trees. Of course, CO2 is absorbed by trees, but we can do so by mechanical means, technological means as well. But mainly, this talk will focus on not putting any more into the atmosphere, and we may get into taking what is there out as well. In terms of the UK then, the amount of CO2 that's being emitted from various activities breaks down like this. And this is from a paper by the government called Powering Our Net Zero Future. You can see that the energy industry emits 67 megatons in 2018. The building sector emitted quite a lot more, 87. Industry, mainly manufacturing industry, 84 megatons. But transport, a whopping 124. Not quite sure what natural resources means in this context. But you can see the major parts of the economy that we need to change. This is another chart by the UK government a bit later on, 2021. Bayes put this into one of their reports. And this looks at the major sources of greenhouse gases, but it also includes the pandemic, which makes it a little bit more interesting to look at. You can see the three major categories here: surface transport, buildings, and electricity. But look how much the electricity emissions have fallen. Since around 2012 or so, we've had major reductions in the CO2 emitted from the power generation sector. But look how little buildings has fallen. And also the second chart, slightly to the right of the line diagram, looks at the rate of change. So the annual changes, if you like, between 2019 and 2020. Aviation has made big reductions in surface transport, which we can kind of discount because that's pandemic related. But also the electricity sector has made massive reductions, and that's not really pandemic related. That's to do with changes in the way that we're generating electricity, mainly lots more wind and solar, and also the coal-fired generation being taken out of service and gas-fired generation taking its place. And then also, of course, there's been relatively little change in the building sector. Very, very difficult to decarbonise buildings. And that's something that my colleague Andy Wright mentioned in one of his talks as part of this series. The UK is, to some extent, leading the way in terms of the legal approach to this, because the UK government has set a number of carbon budgets which are intended to get us towards what was an 80% reduction by 2050 and has now become net zero by 2050. So in the Climate Change Act of 2008, the government introduced a legally binding target of 80% reduction of CO2 emissions by 2050 compared to 1990. The European Union target was a 20% reduction by 2020, so less of a reduction but a much shorter timescale. So to help the UK to manage its progress, they introduced a number of carbon budgets. The first budget we met, the second budget we met. The third budget, we're on target to meet. This is a 37% reduction by 2020, which we did meet, and but the budget goes on until 2022. The problems come in the fourth and fifth budgets, where there is some uncertainty about whether we're going to meet those, and these become really quite steep reductions, 51% by 2025 and 57% by 2030. But the big one, of course, is the sixth budget that was reintroduced since the original budgets came out, which is net zero by 2050. This is a really steep challenge. Not impossible, as I'll try and point out, but difficult. And all of us will feel the impact of this. This is a slide I just put in just this morning because yesterday's news included a legal challenge to the UK government based on the legislation I've just described. The challenge has come from a group called Client Earth, and their lawyers say that a new oil field in Scotland, in the North Sea oil field, will risk fatally undermining efforts to meet the world's climate targets by locking in polluting infrastructure and emissions for decades. And in the context of our promise to be net zero by 2050, their argument is it's just not compatible to explore for any more oil and gas in the North Sea. The government on its side is saying that it's not feasible to have a cliff edge, a sudden stop in our North Sea oil and gas exploration. So there is a kind of a legal face-off, which I think, because of the COP discussions, is quite an interesting one to keep an eye on. The government produced an energy white paper in 2020, which had 10 points. You often hear Boris Johnson talk about 10 points for climate change. And the 10 points are these, many of which have infrastructure implications. Things like cycling and walking, road building, hydrogen, big infrastructure project if we go for it. Greener buildings, of course, Andy mentioned this in a recent talk. And net zero emission vehicles. Lots of talk in the press about the transition to electric vehicles, how expensive it might be, whether the grid can or can't cope with the charging necessary, and so on. We'll come back to that shortly. If we look then at Leicester specifically, we can use this really handy chart, which was produced this year from a research group called CREDS, and it allows us to drill down across the whole country. Actually, it's only England and Wales. I don't think it covers Scotland or Northern Ireland. But you can drill down into very small areas across the country of 1,500, between 1,500 and 3,000 people. So this is looking at the city of Leicester. And in each of those little areas, you can see where the carbon emissions are coming from, what type of activities lead to the carbon emissions. So I use this map to look at the average part of Leicester, which turns out to be Beaumont Leys. So if you look at Leicester's emissions as a whole, and you look at the average, we can look at one particular region of Beaumont Leys, and we can see what people are doing in that area that gives rise to their CO2 emissions. The biggest category is flying, then food and drink, and then recreation. I'm not quite sure what's involved in recreation. So the top three are what you might call behavior change activities, things that people need to change in their behavior to reduce their carbon emissions. The next two, though, are what I would call infrastructure related. So there are emissions to do with the cars that people drive, and that's clearly something that's only really abatable if we change to electric vehicles, which has a big infrastructure implication. And the last one there is gas, burning of gas to heat our homes and buildings, which is something that people are going to struggle to avoid unless there are changes to infrastructure, and unless there are, let's face it, big subsidies that will allow people to install heat pumps. Again, we'll come back to heat pumps shortly. So that's a website that I'd encourage you to have a look at if you want to investigate your own carbon emissions and where they're coming from. The next website I would encourage you to have a look at is this one, which was designed by a team under the late David Mackay, and it's on the Bayes website, and it allows you to experiment with various aspects of the UK's energy infrastructure to see whether you can get this country down to net zero by 2050. So you can see that there are a number of sliders across the bottom then, and if you adjust these sliders in different positions, you can see what kind of impact they would have on the UK's carbon emissions and whether you can meet net zero by 2050 in a way that you think is the least painful way possible. So that's something to have a go at after the talk, I suggest. One of the ways that we can meet our targets would be to go for a lot more cycling. Clearly, this is a big infrastructure implication, and you can see the infrastructure changes by looking on this slide here at a very bad example of terrible infrastructure in Belfast. This isn't, of course, unique to Northern Ireland. There is a bad transport infrastructure for cyclists all over the country, but this one's a nice graphic illustration of how a cycleway becomes a bit more of a slalom course for cyclists in this part of Belfast. The contrast to that is looking at Amsterdam, where anyone that's been there will be aware of the number of cyclists in Amsterdam and just how easy it is to get around that city by bicycle. Not just because it's flat, but because it's safe. And there are wide cycleways. Here's another image from Amsterdam, a really nice, what would you call that sort of bicycle? Anyway, an adult and 3 children on a very long bicycle. And a third Amsterdam image here on a nice sunny day. Not just Amsterdam, though, not far from here in Sheffield, there is a nice example of the separation of cyclists from pedestrians and cars. And that's something I think is absolutely necessary to persuade people who are not currently cyclists to get a bicycle and use it for day-to-day travel. It has to be safe, and it has to be done in a way that's not going to irritate motorcyclists and car drivers and also pedestrians. Then we have another example. This is from Reno in the States, of a really nice wide two-way cycleway, totally separated physically by big solid objects from cars and separated using trees from the pavement. What a paradise that would be for cyclists in Reno. The weather looks nice too there. Just in case you think this is all too expensive, there was a great study by the Department of Transport that shows that the benefits of cycle paths outweigh the costs of cycle paths significantly, can be up to 35 to 1. Typically, the average is 5 times, the benefits are 5 times the cost of introducing cycleways. And they come from things like increases in physical fitness, relief for those who can't cycle, congestion relief for people who have to drive, journey ambience. I'm not quite sure what that means and why there should be a cost benefit to it, but you can see there'll be a really significant cost benefit in the reduction in accidents. More people on bicycles doesn't increase accidents. In fact, it reduces accidents, particularly in cities. So we need a lot more cycling. We also need, I would say, a lot more mass transit in our cities. And trams are a very good way of introducing zero carbon mass transit. The image on the top comes from a study done for Bristol, a project called Trams for Bristol. It's not a very good picture, but it shows you the difference between the number of people you can squeeze onto a tram compared to the number of people that you can squeeze onto buses. It would take 3 buses, compared to the number of cars you would need for the same number of people, 177 cars. So clearly, in terms of moving large numbers of people through a city, trams are an excellent solution. And in this country, we currently have 8 light rail systems doing this. Interestingly, for people listening in Leicester, 2 of these, well, in fact, one of them is very near, and another one is going to be introduced in Coventry, which is also very near. Some people listening to this will use the Nottingham tram system every day, because I know there's a lot of people working at DMU who live in Nottingham. So we have examples close to home of how this would really help in this city. I know the City Council currently doesn't have tram mass transit in its plans for decarbonisation, but they're being talked about, and it's quite possible that urban mass transit using trams will be in a future draft of the city's plan for decarbonisation. It's the most energy efficient mode of travel. What is going to be in the Leicester plan is electric vehicles. And currently, of course, we see electric vehicles every day driving throughout Leicester. Lots of stories in the press pointing out how electric vehicles are a bit of a non-starter because of the cost of producing the batteries. But if you look at this chart that was produced by the ICCT, International Council on Clean Transportation, you can see that the orange band is the emissions from battery manufacture. And look how small it is compared to the emissions from burning fuel, or even the emissions from making the fuel in fuel refineries or making electricity. So the emissions from making batteries is certainly there, but it's relatively small compared to the emissions from internal combustion engine vehicles, and even the emissions from making the electricity in battery electric vehicles. Also, look at how the difference between ICE vehicles compares to emissions from battery vehicles in Europe and in the United States, where there are big savings by driving battery electric vehicles. Compare that with China and India, where there are still savings, but they're much smaller. And that's because the grid, the electricity grid in China and the grid in India, they're both dirtier than the grids in the USA and in Europe. As grids decarbonize, the benefits of driving electric vehicles become much, much stronger. And that's the situation we have in this country. The UK electricity grid is relatively low carbon now and getting better every day as we introduce more wind turbines and more solar power. And so driving an electric vehicle in this country is dramatically better for the environment than driving a petrol or diesel powered vehicle. There are problems, of course, with electric vehicles in terms of charging them and in terms of the cost of buying them. Although second-hand electric vehicles are now, I would say, cost competitive with an old banger. not necessarily to buy, but in terms of operating them and the purchase price put together. So the life cycle cost of a second-hand electric vehicle compared to an old banger for bangonomics, so to speak, is definitely in favor of the electric vehicle. Another form of transport which people tend to not associate with electric transport is aviation. And certainly I thought that we would never have electric aircraft, feasible electric aircraft, apart from a few quirky experiments. But we are now living in an age where it's possible to transport passengers on small electric aircraft, like the one shown in the picture there. And there's research going on which is constantly trying to increase the size of aircraft which can be feasibly powered by electricity. And there is research going on into synthetic aviation fuel, which is made by a combination of CO2 sucked out of the atmosphere, so decarbonising the atmosphere by taking out CO2, combining that gas with hydrogen, which can be made from electrolysis of water, so clean hydrogen. Those two gases combined can give us synthetic hydrocarbons, which can be refined into aviation fuel. It's technically possible. In fact, it's been proven by one of our local heroes in Leicester, Professor Tony Marmont. He had a plant for doing this in his own back garden, which I've seen. And one or two of my colleagues have actually worked with Tony on this form of synthetic aviation fuel manufacture. So technically it's possible. Of course, it's more expensive than drilling for oil and refining it in oil refineries. But then people said that about solar panels in the past. The cost of solar panels has come down dramatically from when they were introduced in the 1950s and 60s. So we know that synthetic aviation fuel is possible, and it's now a question of doing it in volume to drive down the cost. We know that battery-powered flight is now possible. Again, it's a question of driving down the cost of making the batteries. So where we have to fly, there are alternatives to the current high-emission approach to aviation. Of course, many of us can avoid flying altogether if we take holidays that don't include aviation. And we can travel around the country without flying using the train. Mentioned hydrogen there in the talk about aviation. A lot of people talk about hydrogen for a great many other infrastructure approaches to decarbonisation, such as using hydrogen to replace gas boilers and using hydrogen to replace petrol and diesel in our cars. And to this extent, hydrogen is often seen as an easy drop-in solution to highly carbonised forms of transport and heating. The gas boiler solution, it sounds on the face of it a really neat solution. And those of us that can remember the transition from town gas to natural gas will remember that although it was a big infrastructure project, it really just included changes in burners in gas boilers. You didn't necessarily need to rip out the gas boiler itself. You could just do an upgrade to the boiler, and changes in burners to gas-fired power stations, gas-fired processors in industry. It didn't need a wholesale replacement of the gas burning infrastructure itself, and the same pipes were used, and that's the hope for hydrogen. However, there are lots of problems with using hydrogen as a drop-in solution, including the fact that these tiny, tiny molecules of hydrogen will leak much more than current methane molecules in the current gas grid. That's just one problem. Other problems with it as well. There are problems with using fuel cell powered cars, one of which is the cost of these cars. Well, just like with battery electric vehicles, the cost would come down. A much bigger problem is the inefficiency of hydrogen fuel cell powered cars. The hydrogen is made from electricity, which can be generated renewably, of course, but it's much more efficient to use that renewable electricity directly on the grid to recharge electric vehicles. Nevertheless, there is still a big push from the gas industry for hydrogen as a replacement for methane in gas boilers, and a big push from Toyota to still go for fuel cell vehicles. I don't think those are particularly sensible approaches, even though there are some technically interesting pilot schemes for reasons of emissions and cost. My belief, and the belief of many others too, is that we should save hydrogen for essential uses only. And this next chart shows that quite nicely, where we've got the unavoidable uses of hydrogen, for example, for making fertilizer, for growing much of our food, for making methanol for industrial processes, for long-haul aviation, which isn't going to disappear overnight. Where we're going to continue to fly long-haul, we need hydrogen to make sustainable aviation fuel. For the steel industry, we can use hydrogen in the steel industry to avoid using coke. Whereas if you look at the bottom of the hydrogen ladder, we have areas where hydrogen is certainly doable, technically doable, but it's uncompetitive. It's uncompetitive in fuel cell cars, it's uncompetitive for domestic heating, and it's uncompetitive for low temperature industrial heat. Still possibly, in fact, still definitely necessary for high temperature industrial heat. So let's look at where industry, so this is one of the areas of the UK's emissions that needs to be decarbonised, and we'll consider to what extent hydrogen might help us do that. The biggest polluters in the UK's industrial sector are the process industries, but fortunately they tend to be located in very discrete parts of the country where it's feasible technically to decarbonise them using carbon capture. So for example, the chemicals industry and fuel refining plant can be decarbonised using local carbon capture, which can then store the carbon locally before it gets a chance to leak. The iron and steel industry is also located in a small number of discrete locations where the industries can be decarbonised directly. However, we have a lot of dispersed sites of carbon emissions, like the cement industry, the food and drink industry, which is big in this area, where decarbonisation is much more difficult to do. And if you lump all of those sites together, that's actually the biggest part of the industrial emissions in the country. For a lot of these sites, though, decarbonisation will be similar to the way that we can decarbonise domestically. So we can use solar panels, we can use biomass digesters, we can use more energy efficient drives, better electric motors, more highly insulated buildings. We can use the circular economy approaches to reduce waste and to reuse some of the materials that are currently thrown away as feedstock for the next round of manufacturing. And of course, we can recover a lot of the waste heat from industry and put that waste heat into district heating system to reuse the waste heat. So those are some of the ways that we can decarbonize industry. A very interesting one there, I think, is the steel industry, where Volvo this year have pioneered the first, what they call anyway, the first, and I think it is the first fossil fuel steel, fossil fuel free steel. Normally, iron is made by reducing iron ore using carbon, using coke. The coke takes the oxygen away from the iron ore and we're left with iron. But in doing so, it creates a great deal of CO2, which is then just emitted into the atmosphere. Now, as I just mentioned before, that CO2 can be cleaned up at the blast furnaces directly using carbon capture. But Volvo and Hybrit, kind of a company made of the Swedish state and SSAB, Volvo and Hybrit together have produced a process that doesn't even use coke at all. It takes the oxygen from the iron ore directly using hydrogen, making water or making steam, and what comes out of it is zero carbon iron, which is then converted into steel. And the first fossil-free steel has been used to make this earth-moving machinery, which you can see in the bottom image there. So again, like a lot of these technologies, Volvo has demonstrated that it's technically possible. They're not saying how expensive it was to do, but these things, you know, it's a lot cheaper than the alternative, which is rising sea levels. It's drought, it's people, it's fires. It's, you know, global warming is an absolutely catastrophic future if we don't find the cash to use some of these processes that have been developed. The other sector where emission abatement is very difficult is the building sector. In a previous talk, my colleague Andy Wright talked a lot about retrofitting to reduce the emissions from our buildings. And this diagram here shows how difficult it is and how expensive it would be to abate the emissions from the residential building sector. The big orange block here represents the abatement cost of reducing the CO2 from the country's buildings. On the other side of the same diagram, you can see that there is actually a cost benefit if we abate the cost of generation from the electricity supply and also from cars and vans. So we'll save money as well as saving emissions by reducing the emissions from transport and from electricity. So I would say that it's much cheaper to reduce carbon emissions from buildings by converting to electric heating than it is to retrofit insulation. Of course, we should do both. The next diagram shows very graphically how we need to abate emissions from buildings. The UK has the worst buildings of all of mainland Europe in terms of the thermal efficiency of the building. This diagram here from Tado, who make thermostats, shows how if you switched off the heating in a UK building compared to any other European country, after 5 hours, the UK building would have lost more heat or more temperature than any other country. We would have lost 3 degrees C after 5 hours, whereas in Norway, just less than 1 degree, even in Spain. And you would think that if ever there is a country in Europe that doesn't need to insulate, it would be Spain. They still have better buildings than we do. So we are a long way from where we need to be in terms of reducing carbon emissions from buildings. Some of the ways that we can do that are to put back hot water cylinders. This is a much better way of heating hot water using, say, an electric thermostat, an electric immersion heater than using a gas boiler. Or we can use solid state storage. This thing, I won't try and explain how this works, but we have an example of one of these in the Energy Lab downstairs in the Queen's building. It's a sun amp heat battery that stores heat in a chemical instead of in a hot water cylinder. So these are approaches to thermal storage and thermal efficiency. The government produced a future homes standard in 2019, where a lot of people thought they were promising to mandate no new gas boilers after 2025. That was in the future homes standard. And a lot of the industry got very excited about this, and they thought we were going to enter into a new era of heat pump installations. And in fact, the government included in that standard the difference between the number of heat pumps in the country at the moment, which was 250,000, compared to the number of gas boilers, 24 million gas boilers. Their strategy in that document was to target an installation of 600,000 heat pumps per annum by 2028, an enormous target that we're nowhere near reaching at the moment, partly due to the cost of the heat pumps. Now, there are, as many of you will know, subsidies available to those who want to take out a gas boiler and introduce a heat pump, but the subsidies are not the full cost of the heat pump. They do go a long way towards doing it, and I have colleagues who work with me who have done this. To their credit, they've taken out a gas boiler, replaced it with a heat pump. Absolutely excellent, but still rather expensive. But there is no excuse in my mind no excuse for the installation of a gas boiler in a new building. New buildings can be very, very well insulated such that a heat pump will be cheaper to operate, and it should be very little more expensive to install than a gas boiler. So in my view, all new buildings really should have heat pumps installed in them. The latest government document on this subject is the Home and Building Strategy, which was delayed and finally came out last month. And in there, sadly, the government has weakened the commitment to no new gas boilers. It's now worded something like an ambition to reduce the number of gas boilers in new build. So there is now wiggle room for the buildings industry, sadly, which will allow them to continue to install gas boilers in new buildings. And I really think if anything comes out of the COP this week and next week, it should be a commitment to go back to the previous promise for no new gas boilers in new buildings. It's absolutely the least the government can do in terms of holding the building industry's feet to the fire. No pun intended. There are no regrets then from increasing thermal efficiency and introducing heat networks. And there are some really great examples from the rest of Europe where heat networks have been able to decarbonize the countries really more significantly than we've ever managed in this country. We'll come back to heat networks shortly. We'll see some of the big developments that have happened in Scandinavia particularly. But there are also plans to introduce a really innovative low temperature heat network in Oxford. Let's look then at what the alternatives would be to heat pumps as we go towards net zero. Well, previously, if you remember, our target for 2050 was 80% reduction. And with an 80% target, it's quite feasible to have a large number of gas boilers in the UK's building stock. Okay, this chart here from the Energy Systems Catapult shows that it would be quite feasible for the country to have a large number of gas boilers in many of its buildings and some heat pumps in other buildings that would be compatible with an 80% reduction by 2050. However, as we go towards net zero, it becomes less and less compatible. And if you're serious about net zero, even if we only went to 95% decarbonisation by 2050, there is absolutely no room for gas boilers. So net zero really does mean zero gas. There is no doubt about it. How can we do that then if we don't talk about heat pumps? Well, we could burn hydrogen. So this is one alternative. Making blue hydrogen, which is made as it's currently made from methane, but then decarbonising the emissions from that process. So that's what's called blue hydrogen. It's relatively dirty because we get methane leaks, we get carbon leaks, but nevertheless, it would allow us to produce hydrogen that could then be burned in hydrogen boilers in our homes. As I said, it's fairly dirty and it's inefficient, only 58% efficient. An alternative is to make green hydrogen. So this is hydrogen made from electrolysis. So it's a cleaner process and it uses clean electricity from wind farms. So we use the electricity from the wind farms to electrolyze water, produce hydrogen, and use that in our homes, burn it in the homes to produce heat using hydrogen boilers. It's clean, but it's inefficient. In fact, it's even worse than the blue hydrogen approach. 46% efficient, but at least it's clean. We need a lot more wind farms, wind turbines to do it, but it would work. Another approach is similar to what we do at the moment with the addition of carbon capture. So this is using natural gas in our power stations to make electricity, which we do at the moment, but then capturing the emissions from the power station using carbon capture and using the electricity in heat pumps. So this is much more efficient, 173% efficient, because the heat pumps magnify the energy. I won't go into the details of how they do that. You'll have to see a different talk that I did to understand how that works. But many of you will understand how heat pumps work anyway. So we get more heat out of a heat pump than we put electricity in, but we have to capture the carbon dioxide. And so it's relatively dirty because some of it will leak away, but it's very efficient. The best approach from the point of view of cleanliness and efficiency is wind turbines and wind farms and solar cells or solar PV. So a totally decarbonized grid feeding into electric heat pumps in our homes and in our cities. They don't have to be in our actual buildings. They can be larger city scale devices. It's both more efficient than the other solutions and much cleaner. This is really what we should target. And it's not science fiction, it's absolutely feasible. Some countries are doing this, we're doing this in some areas of this country, but it just needs to be rolled out at much bigger scale, which will be expensive. Even if we don't do this, even if we don't go for heat pumps, even if we heat our homes with electricity, so using clean electricity, but not in heat pumps, using electric radiators, electric fires, we can even use electric wallpaper, believe it or not. There is a company in this country that's producing electric wallpaper that will radiate heat into your building. That's still cleaner now than burning gas. Relatively recently, the grid was decarbonized to the point where it's now cleaner. A kilowatt hour of electricity is now cleaner in terms of emissions than a kilowatt hour of gas burned in a boiler. So electric heating is now the best way from an emissions point of view of heating our buildings. But if you use that electricity in a heat pump, it's much cleaner because the heat pump magnifies the benefit. Generally speaking, you will have a coefficient of performance between 2 and 3, might be as high as 4 under some conditions, and the emissions there are much, much cleaner than using gas. So what are the options for using heat pumps? We don't all have to install a big heat pump in our house. Some people can install a very small heat pump. This is a device from Kensa, a UK company, called a shoebox, because it's similar to the size of a shoebox. You can see how it compares to the size of a broom in somebody's broom cupboard. So this is a shoebox Kensa. It's a ground source heat pump. And in this case, it's taking heat from a low temperature grid buried in the ground near a block of flats. This is a proposal that Kensa have made for Oxford. So they're going to pilot this scheme for a low temperature heat network for low-rise flats in Oxford. Another version of a similar idea is a high temperature heat pump. This is the heat pump itself, made by a company in Glasgow called Star Refrigeration and installed in the city of Drammen in Norway. This heat pump takes heat from a fjord, so very low temperature heat, but because of the way a heat pump works, it then magnifies that heat to be hot enough to feed around the city of Drammen into the district heating system. So Norwegians, like a lot of Scandinavians, have district heat, but here the heat is being taken from a fjord using these high temperature heat pumps from Star Refrigeration. Another approach, another big infrastructure approach, the Danes are very keen on using solar heat for their heating systems, for their district heating systems. So they've got networks of solar farms, like the one you can see in the top right here, which collect heat, mainly in the summer, of course, and a little bit in the spring, a little bit in the autumn, and store the heat underground. And they use it because you don't need that much heat in the summer, but you can pull it out of the storage in the colder months and feed it into district heating networks to heat the city. So this is how it works. In the summer, they've got more than they need, so they store the surplus underground, and then in the autumn, they take it out of the stores, feed it into district heating, and then as you get past October, they start to need to replace that heat with other forms of heat, like, for example, heat pumps it might be, or biomass boilers, or a range of different things. And then as you come around to the winter and the spring, you're still using some of the stored heat. You're using more of the alternatives until March time, the solar systems start to generate. And by the time you get to May, you've completely gone back onto solar heating. So there's 120 villages, towns and cities in Denmark that use solar district heating. Denmark's climate, of course, is not that much different from ours. We could do this in this country. Even if we choose not to do that, even if we choose to go just for solar power, wind power, and battery storage, it's been calculated that we can completely decarbonize the UK's electricity grid by overbuilding the amount of generation. If we generate 3 times the amount that we consume at the moment, and that's to account for the times when the wind doesn't blow or the sun isn't shining. So 3 times the capacity of the energy that we actually use, combined with battery storage, will allow us to 100% decarbonize electricity generation in this country. And this is an estimate from a group called Rethink X. There's an energy entrepreneur in the USA called Tony Seba, who has produced these graphs and this estimate. But even in this country, the UK's national grid has done similar studies. They've looked at scenarios for decarbonisation towards 2050. And one of their scenarios they've called a consumer transformation scenario. And that's this one here, which has a number of different technologies that combine to decarbonise by 2050. And you can see that if you look at the figures, it's similar to the previous slide, 3.5 times today's generation. So in other words, if we take 100% of our demand at the moment, we multiply that by 3.5, and that's the amount of clean generation. Combine that with storage, we can decarbonize the grid totally. And that's to make the point about the additional demand from heat pumps and electric vehicles. Many people worry about the infrastructure, the electricity infrastructure, whether it can cope with heat pumps and electric vehicles. This is a couple of graphs from the future energy scenarios, again from the national grid in this country, looking at how a combination of heat pumps and electric vehicles will add demand, but that demand can be tamed by moving it around in time, by scheduling the demand at different times, and also by using the batteries within our electric vehicles as a form of electricity storage. Smart charging and what they call vehicle to grid are both ways that we can actually reduce the amount of storage that we need on the grid to meet our future demand. So in answer to the question, can the existing grid deliver net zero? A number of people have done studies where they've showed that actually the additional demand isn't as horrendous as you might expect. And there are technologies that will absolutely allow the grid to be decarbonized to allow us to use electric vehicles and heat pumps and still deliver net zero. One of those studies was by Watson et al. I've put the link down below here. Some of you will remember Kevin Lomas from when he worked at DMU. He's now at Loughborough, and he worked with Simon Watson and this chap I don't know on a study which I've shown a couple of their charts here. I hope they won't mind because I've given their reference in energy policy that shows that we don't need to worry nearly as much as many people do about decarbonising the grid. I want to end with a kind of a moral claim as to why we should do this in the UK. Yes, the transition is difficult, but the UK was the world's first high carbon economy. The UK is still fifth in the list of cumulative emissions. If you add together all the carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution, 1750, the UK is fifth in the list of cumulative emissions, behind countries like the USA, China, Russia, and Germany. Okay, so we're very small as a country, but our emissions have been absolutely enormous if you add them together since we were the first high carbon economy. In fact, right up until 1950, half of the world's cumulative emissions came from Europe, and that was mostly from the UK. So I would say that we have led the world in creating CO2. We now need to lead the world in cutting CO2. And that, I hope, is a message that will come out of the COP. We still have the fifth largest GDP in the world. So it's an interesting coincidence that we have the fifth highest cumulative emissions, but we also have the fifth largest GDP, which I would say is we can afford the transition. Here is another chart that shows the cumulative emissions, and you can see the big orange one here is the European emissions, most of which came from the UK. And this is why. The Industrial Revolution, of course, developed in the UK and was responsible for a huge amount of emissions. If you go to Our World in Data and you look until the year 1850, you will see that the dirtiest part of the whole world was the UK. And of course, that was the Industrial Revolution. Nice pictures like this one showing where all the emissions came from. We were the dirtiest country in the world by some way in 1850. We've come a long way towards cleaning up since then, but we've a long way still to go. This is a nice, I think, historical fact that the earliest carbon abatement law was in 1273, when Queen Eleanor complained about smoke from burning sea coal. Her son, King Edward I, you may know him from Braveheart. He was Edward Longshanks, the baddie in Braveheart. But one good thing he did was he set up a commission to inquire all who burnt such sea coal in the city or parts adjoining were to be punished. Their first offence, they would have great fines and ransoms. For the second offence, their furnaces would be demolished. It turns out that repeat offenders could actually be killed. So Edward Longshanks didn't mess around when it came to legally mandated reductions in carbon emissions. Okay. In the future then, after COVID, how do we build back better, to use one of our Prime Minister's phrases? One of the approaches that's being recommended by this research group, Energy Rev, is to go for smart local energy systems. Some of the measures that we can use to measure our progress are building energy efficiency, number of low carbon heat systems, low carbon mobility, and so on. We can capitalize on smart local energy systems, which have a number of different aspects to them, to unlock better value and to drive economic recovery. But one thing that I think is a reason for absolutely going for this is the social equity part of low carbon local energy systems. If we are serious about a just transition, a transition that benefits everyone, not just those who can afford heat pumps, not just those that have the knowledge, like people like me who are lucky enough to work in this area, all of us can benefit from a just transition, and smart local energy systems promise a way of doing that. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to read more about this, these are some books that I recommend. I have read, let me see, 1, 2, 3. Yes, I've read all of those ones, all personally recommended by me. Of course, there are a great many other books on this subject, but those are all recent books on the subject that are absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm now in a position to take some questions. Hopefully they've been building up in the Q&A, and I'll try to answer some of those. Thank you. Okay, I have a question here from Andrew Reeves. Updating the infrastructure is usually a slow multi-year process, and our carbon emissions budget to live within 1.5 degrees average global warming is running short. Yes, it is. Our budget for the whole century in Leicester would only cover 7 years emissions. What could we prioritise now that would greatly speed up significant emission cuts? Oh my word, prioritise. Well, personally, I think, well, you see the map I showed of the nation's emissions by those small areas of the population. If you look at Leicester in that map, you can see what certain individuals within Leicester, and in fact all those different areas, should prioritise. I'm not calling out Beaumont Leys in particular, but I can remember that one from the chart. It seems like flying. Flying changes to diet and changes to the way that we do our recreation. I guess that means driving around the countryside. So aviation and diet, big things that we can do now, which we can do as individuals. We could change our flying habits tomorrow. We could change our diet tomorrow. So in terms of immediate changes, aviation and diet. In terms of longer things, yes, we need to decarbonize our homes. Yes, we need to think about changing the way that we drive to electric vehicles. We definitely need to cycle more, personal fitness reasons, apart from anything else. I've put on weight over the pandemic. I was losing weight nicely through cycling before then. Anyway, that's a personal reflection. I hope that answers your question, Andrew. Any other questions from anybody? No more at present. Okay, well, I hope that's given you all something to think about. As I say, there's some good references there that I recommend for reading. I can put those back up on the screen. In fact, I think they're still showing. Yes, they are. And I hope that's given you some food for thought in terms of infrastructure for net zero. Thank you very much.